Hello, this is Kesha Rogers with LaRouche Pack, and I have a special update and report for you. On last month, many of you remember that I was joined by my colleague Brian Lance, and we did a special update and report on the Texas energy grid called Texas Grid Still in Shambles as Summer Heat Wave Hits. ERCOT says conserve. And this update came 4 months after a massive winter freeze devastated the state and left millions without power for days. So a lot has happened since that time. And today, joining me, I have Gregg Goodnight. Gregg and I had a chance to encounter each other recently at the CPAC conference that just took place a few weeks ago. So, Gregg is a chemical engineer and he is with the CO2 Coalition. His work focuses on climate science and public policy. So, he's going to give us a little bit of insider update as to what's now transpiring with the energy crisis in Texas, some of the updates on legislation that's now underway, and also to discuss what is actually going on in terms of what's happening with the need for increased energy capacity. So before I turn it over, I'm going to immediately turn it over to Gregg to give us his thoughts, what he has found out by being in some of the hearings at the Texas legislature, and also his insight and expertise on the impact of the climate policies, the green climate agenda on our, not just the Texas grid, but on national policy overall. So go ahead and introduce Gregg, let him say a little bit more about himself and go ahead and just give us an update on what he is working on. And I'll come back and may have some questions for him shortly here.
Kesha, it's a pleasure meeting you again. Thanks for this opportunity. Appreciate your interest, and it's an honor to be sponsored by you and your organization. You do some very good work in climate and energy, and if I can help out a little bit, I'm more than happy to do that. As Kesha mentioned, my career has been in engineering. I was a trained chemical engineer, and the last part of my career, I actually worked on Wall Street a bit. So I have a sciencey background, and since I've been retired 4 years ago, I've done some local networking with other retired engineers, including specifically a nuclear engineer, a geophysicist and reservoir engineer, a electrical engineer who also did power analysis and power control down here in South Texas, and an excellent chemist. So we have a little informal group and we communicate a lot. We share models and we share thoughts, and they help me work through some of the issues that we ran into in February in the Texas grid. Where I got started in this was last year. In 2020, California started having its brownouts, and I thought to myself, well, ERCOT had a little bit of a EEA1 where the responsive reserve went to below 3,000 megawatts. I said, well, how is Texas doing vis-a-vis California? We can't possibly be as messed up as California. So that started my journey last year, and we started doing some research and some balances and all that. And about this time, we were getting ready to write reports and all this. The February Texas grid outage happened. So we did a lot of work. We listened to all the hearings, both in Texas House and in the U.S. Congress, and we looked at the EI data and ERCOT data. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on our interpretation of what happened in the Texas grid. There are also recent reports out by the University of Texas Energy Institute, the Mitchell Foundation. In fact, NERC and FERC are going to be looking at the grid outage also. And the reports that have been issued so far sort of are in parallel to our group, but we take a little bit of a longer term view. Some of the key issues that are going on here that we relay to people is what is going on is the cumulative effect of energy policy, pricing policy in Texas that was after the deregulation happened in about 2000. The Public Utility Commission of Texas set deregulation. ERCOT has been controlling the grid, and what's happened over the years is the renewable power has gone from an insignificant part of the grid to, in 2020, it was actually 25% of the power delivered to the grid, and it is basically the green energy has been subsidized to the tune of over $20 billion with the transmission line, the so-called CREZ transmission line, the federal incentives, the investment tax credits, the production tax credits, and the like. So another, the deregulation was supposed to make a level playing field, but quite honestly, it's been a tilted playing field, which is supported the growth of green energy, which is fine, but we've gotten to a point where green energy, specifically wind energy, which is dominant in Texas, has grown to a significant piece, and pushing in the energy from the green sources is becoming a more dominant factor. And the key issue, which is missed in all this, is the intermittency of wind and solar power becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger issue once you get into higher levels of delivered power to the grid. So we're at 25% now. And the other thing that we have to look at is, in the future, by 2025, we're going to grow to 38% of the grid. The delivered power to the grid is green energy. Now, the problem with intermittent energy versus deliverable energy, what we call thermal energy, which is coal, nuclear, and natural gas, is what's called dispatchability. Dispatchability is when you really need something, it shows up. Like if we're having a heart attack at 2 o'clock in the morning, you call for an ambulance, then they say, "Nah, I'm sorry, we can't get you your ambulance till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Well, you need it when you need it, and that's the same thing with energy.
So that question about that, Greg, just to make the point here. So what you're discussing, this was recently brought up in an article where now what's coming forward is the leaders of the Public Utility Commission and the Electricity Reliability Council, ERCOT, has said that they are moving toward a redesign of how Texas electricity markets provides incentives to power generators to produce a more stable flow of electricity to the state's electricity grid. So
yeah,
where is this going? I think that gets to where you're.
Well, this is what you've hit on is the nub of the issue, and where I was getting to is the cumulative effect of the prior policies over 20 years has basically added a lot of wind and solar power, and at the same time, the amount of deliverable power, being a coal and natural gas and all that, is going down. For instance, between now and 2025, ERCOT projects we're going to add 17 gigawatts of new green energy, and heavily weighted towards solar, some wind. And actually, if you look at the retirements, we're going down 4 gigawatts of coal and natural gas. One of the things you realize is the economics has totally favored green energy from the standpoint of there's very little new coal and natural gas based power going into the grid. So what you're saying is the PUC is looking at our current pricing policies. Texas is the pricing is a day ahead bidding, and it's energy only. So there is no economic incentive for reliability, no economic incentive for deliverability of power to the grid. And this has been fine as long as the renewable intermittent energy has been at a relatively low level. You can squeeze in a little bit more wind, a little bit less. for instance, wind on a daily basis, and just recently has gone from over 10 gigawatts of production, and the wind stops blowing, and all of a sudden you're at 0.2 gigawatts out of 30 capacity. So the intermittency is something that the renewable industry has not owned, and part of the proposals is that they would compensate either by buying additional ancillary services, putting in additional capacity, whatever. But we've gotten to the point where renewables are such a large percentage of the Texas power grid that you have to have the backup power. One of the things that happened specifically in the February outage is, well, there were three big causes. Number one is Storm Uri was an unusually strong storm at 75 gigawatts of load. The second thing is there were 10 to 12 gigawatts of thermal capacity that was down because of maintenance. The third thing that happened is that wind and solar went from over 10 gigawatts on the 14th to below 2 gigawatts on the 15th. And at the critical period, it was at 5 or 6 gigawatts. So those three things in combination almost collapsed the entire Texas grid. Yes, there wasn't one single thing that happened, but the cumulative effect of not adding deliverable power and putting in the intermittent power of wind and solar is what got us in trouble. You can look at the meteorological data and the wind generation of power in that period. And what happens when you have one of these big cold fronts come through is immediately after, the wind dies. And the power you can generate from wind is a function of the velocity cubed of the wind. So that a 50% reduction in wind results in a 90% reduction in power. And that's what happened as the front blew through. And this was not only Texas, this was all the way up the central part of the United States, all the way up to Canada, where the wind quit blowing. So anyway, we've gotten to a place where we can't just sweep this under the rug anymore. Something has to happen. And there are solutions out there. There are quick start peaking units based on natural gas that if the wind quits blowing or we lose some thermal capacity or whatever, they can kick in and we don't go into a critical situation. Now, as far as the legislation going on, the key bill that was passed recently in the Senate was called SB3. It is the Texas Grid Reliability Bill. While it doesn't prescriptively fix the problems, it does call for looking, like you're saying, at the pricing policy that affects the long-term, how much power you put in, what types of power, what type of backup is needed. And another thing it does is it fixes the incentives for instance, the coal plants right now are 30 to 40 years old on average. The average age of the natural gas-based plants are 15 years old. And what happens is marginal economics, the pricing has been set up so these guys cannot make a profit, and they have to watch their pennies and can't spend a lot for big preventive maintenance projects. So, I mean, we have to get the economics back in balance where these people can maintain their plants in a reliable basis. And that's what SB3 is doing. SB3 gives the power to the Public Utility Commission to fix the underlying problems. So with that, if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them, and we could put this in the context.
I know you have some things to share with us as well to develop this a little bit more. I think one of the things that is now being put on the agenda is the question of moving from energy markets to capacity markets. And this, not just the power that you're going to have online. I think it's important to say, and this is something LaRouche PAC and what we've been involved in, and I think President Trump made this very clear, that the wind and solar has been inefficient forms of energy capacity. But at the same time, when you look at it, the question of capacity markets, not just paying for what's online, but also having preparations for what's going to be needed in the future is now something being seriously discussed and considered. So before you go on here, the other thing as far as the energy online, and you may want to weigh in on this as well, one of the things that has shown to be very efficient energy sources of power is what we've seen from what Texas has had with their nuclear production, including what we've had from the Comanche Peak facility as well as the South Texas project. And from what I understand, there is motion toward actually increasing those facilities and adding additional capacity to those facilities, which
Yeah.
may be very important in this context.
Yeah, you make some very good points. Nuclear is very reliable, but it is not. uh, Basically, what has to happen, you have to balance the grid at every point in time. You cannot store electrons. So in physically, what happens is nuclear sits there and it runs 95 to 100%. It provides what's called base load power, which is a good base power supply. And then what you have is wind and solar doing this. I mean, they can go up, they can massively change within a day. Wind peaks at 3 in the morning, it dies in the afternoon. Solar is going great at noon, and the sun doesn't shine at night. So what happens is nuclear stays steady, wind and solar going up and down. So to balance the grid, the gas has to be modulated to make up the difference between the sources of supply and the total load. And what happens is as you get more and more renewables, the gymnastics that the gas production has to do gets more and more radical. In fact, we're working on some balances that say by 2025, we do not have enough gas capacity to balance on a daily basis the modulations in wind. So, for wind can go through an extreme, it can go from very high to very low, and you just have to have enough balancing capacity, so to speak, which is basically natural gas and to some extent coal, and you don't have that. Now, the other thing you mentioned about the paying for deliverability and capacity, ERCOT is what's called an energy-only market. You only get paid for the electrons you stick in the grid. You do not get paid for that capacity that's sitting there idle, that's ready to go when you have load. And but the capacity markets, as practiced in other regions, are not really efficient. It's a very difficult situation that the PUC is facing, and how to get a pricing system that rewards dispatchable power and rewards consistency of power going into the grid. So Peter Lake, who's the head of the PUC, has mentioned this, and it's going to take a while to redesign our economic system for the power. But really, that's what has to happen. What happened in February was not only the immediate impact of Uri, the offline things, and wind and solar going down, but it was a cumulative effect of pricing policy over 20 years that related to the growth in wind and solar. So yeah, good observations. It's not an easy job, but it has to happen if we're going to have a reliable system.
Okay, good. Go ahead. I know you have some things you wanted to share as well on the overall effects of the climate policy.
Okay, is this the part where we put in our screen here?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, Kesha, did I do it right? Because I am not very good at this.
Yes, you have it.
Okay.
Very good.
All right. As I mentioned, I've been retired for about 4 years. I've done some local networking with engineers. I also done some national networking with some very, very prominent, very good groups. One of them is the Right Climate Stuff based in Houston. The other is with the CO2 Coalition. So I've gone from a small 2-ring binder when I retired to about 50 pounds of notes, books. I've read about 30 books on climate change, and climate change is absolutely captivating in terms of not only the scientific part, but the sociological, narratives, the political implications, the policy implications, and the like. And I will say this from the outset, and I'm not going to belabor a lot of this, but can you see my second page here, Kesha? It says climate change narrative.
Not
Can you
yet.
see that?
Oh, yeah.
Not yet.
I see a real climate change threat, and then it has a list of bullet points.
Okay.
Okay, now I see it. Go ahead.
Now you see it. Okay, excellent. Uh, that was nip and tuck, but here's my conclusion. Agree with me or don't agree with me if you study this. Climate change is not science used in the current vernacular. It is really what it has evolved to is a politically useful propagandistic narrative. The climate, I will make the point, the climate has always changed over 4.2 billion years that the Earth has existed. So climate change is almost an oxymoron. It's a self-contradicting fact because climate has always changed. And the people that really get it are the geologists. I've networked with 2 or 3 geologists, and they get it. But the narrative, I can paraphrase the narrative, and it's down here. It says, climate is controlled by man's increasing production of the poisonous gas, carbon dioxide, that once emitted remains in the atmosphere thousands of years and is the primary source of global warming. This has extreme weather consequences and will eventually make the Earth uninhabitable. The only way to stop this dangerous trend is through the abolition of fossil fuels and the transition to renewable energy on an expedited basis. To me, I'm paraphrasing what I perceive as the public view of what the term climate change is. I will say that everything that's underlined here from a scientific standpoint is false. And the climate change narrative is a very useful narrative. And I count there are about 14 other agendas that this narrative it helps, all the way from crony capitalism, population control, globalism, socialism, earth worship. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You can cloak yourself in this green cloak of virtue. You can go on about how bad climate change is and all that. And it like I say, it's a very useful narrative. So this is my conclusion after 5 years of working at it. The one thing that people try to do is make this into a very simple narrative. This is the Al Gore thing, that it's so simple, even a 4th grader can understand it. It's CO2, more CO2 is bad, less CO2 is better. Kaboom, it's done. Let me tell you, this is one of the most complicated areas that you can possibly get into. And to have a full appreciation, you would have had to spend as many years on this as I have. But this is my bottom line after 5 years. Believe me or not, this is the conclusion I come to. So let's talk about current events in climate change. Okay. Now let's see if we can get to the next slide. Okay, the Paris Agreement. People have heard about this, and there was a lot of screaming and hollering when Trump withdrew. There was a lot of hosannas when Biden got back into it. I don't think people have read the fine print in the Paris Agreement. There are several good books on what is in the fine print in the Paris Agreement, and I would suggest to anybody to go read some of the books because they're very eye-opening. You got to drill down a little bit. So this is one of the first acts Biden had, is to recommit the U.S. to the Paris Agreement to save the planet. Biden actually doubled our prior commitment under Obama to reductions of CO2 gas to 3 gigatons from 1.5 gigatons. Now, this is, to put in perspective, the U.S. emits 5 to 6 gigatons of CO2. So these are significant reductions, and in real terms, it will cost the U.S. dollars to stick to the commitments. The Paris Agreement, people don't understand that, is a collection of non-binding commitments. They're by countries. The countries said, okay, I want to commit X, I want to commit Y. They stapled them all together and said, this is the Paris Agreement, but not a single one is enforceable. And in fact, very few are currently meeting the targets that they've established. So that you say, well, that doesn't sound like a very tough agreement. I mean, you can posture and politically virtue signal all you want, but in reality, the amount of dollars you spend is basically your option. There's something else called the Green Climate Fund. Part of the issue here was the poorer countries, the developing countries, didn't want to pay for this expensive thing. So the compromise was to have the rich countries pay the poor countries for their conversion, their transition. And the Green Climate Fund was targeted 100 billion a year that was going to be funded by so-called Annex 1 countries or rich countries and paid to Annex 2 countries sort of on a project by project basis. Well, surprise, surprise, guess which big country, which is the largest CO2 emitter in the world, is an Annex 2 country. Turns out it's China. So, how logical and how sane does that appear to be? In the same period that we're looking to meet these commitments, China's projected to go up 5, maybe as many as 7 gigatons out of about a 12 gigaton base. They double our CO2 emissions, and they have committed to reducing CO2 emissions on an absolute basis starting about 2060. So China's cut a pretty good deal. The Western nations in the US, maybe not so. Here's the bottom line. If all countries met their Paris commitments, according to our current climate models, global temperatures would only decrease 0.2 centigrade from their 2100 projections. So this is very expensive. The transition, which you'll hear this term, the transition, which means transition from fossil fuels to green or renewable energy. One bank has estimated that the cost is $3.5 trillion a year for at least a decade globally. This is big money, and you have to ask: is the benefit 0.2 centigrade worth the big money? To me, we need to think hard about what is the cost benefit. One of the executive orders Biden signed very soon after getting into office is that we were no longer to consider cost benefit analysis on climate-based solutions. So, if that's the way you run your family or your checkbook or whatever, okay, I'm going to spend $100 million for a little bit of insurance, or cost benefit has to come in here somewhere. Okay, so that's Paris Agreement. Let's see if we can get to the next one. Okay, can you see that, Kesha? UN climate activities?
Yes.
2021. Okay, 2021's a big year for global climate initiatives. The UN obviously is a huge supporter of global climate change initiatives. And quite honestly, their agenda is they see this as a key to globalization, global governance. They can expand their importance. They can hire thousands more bureaucrats. I mean, they're right in the catbird seat when it comes to this. They have programs that they define, such as sustainability or Agenda 21, which they basically want to micromanage resources, global resources. So this fits right in with their objectives. In this year, they're going to issue what's called AR6. The IPC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They issue reports every several years. Well, this year it's report number 6. And while the report has been leaked a little bit to some news organizations, the ones that favor more governance and all, it hasn't become available. But you can bet your bottom dollar they're going to say that the human attribution to global warming and climate change is even more certain. They'll urge policymakers to take immediate actions. They'll ramp up the propaganda, and here we go again. So wait for AR6. It's supposed to come out this year. In October this year, they're going to have COP26. COP is Conference of the Parties. It's going to be held in Glasgow, Scotland, and it's going to, all the world leaders will come, and Al Gore will fly in on his private jet, and There'll be a big hoot brouhaha, but there'll be a lot of political posturing, virtue signaling, and all that. But that's going to happen later in the year. Now, of course, Joe Biden is probably going to want to make a big splash, and the U.S. is committed to all these targets, and it's green virtue signaling to the extreme.
They're definitely already preparing for this.
Oh yeah, they're ramping up.
Meetings going on right now as we speak in preparation for the COP26 conference.
Absolutely. The New York Times and all the people that carry the water for this are going to go nuts. If you look at the climate science, though, if you look at real science, not the propagandistic narrative, you can argue that the case for alarmism is getting weaker and weaker. For instance, there's something called the equilibrium climate sensitivity, which is how much does the temperature go up per doubling of CO2. The literature, cumulative literature is going down in terms of CO2 is less of a contributor to global warming. What really contributes to global warming, and what a lot of the science says now, are these 14 cosmological geophysical cycles that we're in: the de Vries cycle, the Hale cycle, the Schwab cycle. In fact, there's a big case for global cooling to really kick in hard about 2040. Now, this is something I look at. I haven't drawn firm conclusions, but the people that claim that global cooling is right around the corner aren't a bunch of nuts. They're scientists, and they're looking at this, but it all boils down to cosmological, geophysical, and terrestrial cycles. So without going through that in much detail, I will say I think the true climate science, is converging on an area that's anti-alarmism rather than pro-alarmism. Okay, moving on to the next one. Let's see if we can get that. Okay, are you okay? Can you see key federal legislation?
Yes.
Okay, one of the things I do is I track legislation both in the Texas legislature and in the national legislature, and there is some massive stuff that's coming down the pipe with this new administration that people need to be aware of. The one is this so-called Clean Futures Act, HR 1512, and the big issue here is they're shooting for 100% renewable power by 2035. This means no gas, no coal, and a major expansion of wind and solar, maybe even connected with a national grid initiative. Extremely expensive, extremely questionable whether you can even do intermittent power of wind and solar at this scale. They're calling for 80% renewable power by 2030, which is an extremely tight time, saying this is a very expensive issue. You can pull up the text for HR 1512. It's over 900 pages. It's eye-watering. It's amazing. They've had hearings on this bill. This is not a figment of imagination. They've had actual hearings on this bill. You can go on the website. Dan Crenshaw is in the climate subgroup of the Energy Committee. This is very, very interesting, but I encourage you to become familiar with HR 1512. The second big, there are a lot of these climate and energy related bills. I've just picked out the two that I thought were very significant. The Energy Dividend and Carbon Innovation Act, HR 2307, is in the 117th legislature nationally. HR 763 was the 116th. So this has been reintroduced to the 117th from the 116th. The intent here, among other things, is what's called carbon taxes. This one hasn't had hearings yet, but let's talk about what they're saying with carbon taxes. The basic concept with carbon taxes is if you tax something, you get less of it. This is an intent to be a, quote, market-driven way to reduce greenhouse gases and fossil fuels. So let's move on to carbon tax proposals. there have been in the 116th legislature, there were about 8 of these carbon tax proposals. None of them made it through, but let me tell you, they are working on it. What a carbon tax is these proposals are becoming more numerous. There's a huge push to get Republican senators to sign off. I assume you can see the slide, Kesha,
Yes, you're
on
good.
carbon taxes. The typical legislative proposal is to tax carbon about $50 per metric ton. This would be an addition at the gas pump, at your natural gas, and this, would apply to any sources of fossil fuels. The regressive nature, in other words, it hurts poor people the worst, would be offset by establishing a trust fund. They call this carbon dividends. And what the government would do is they would have this trust fund, they would collect tax money, they would dividend some of the trust fund to lower income families, and that supposedly will counteract the regressive nature of the tax. The non-competitive nature of the tax, in other words, it raises U.S. industry prices or industry costs, would be compensated for by a so-called border tax adjustment. That if you say got an import from a nation that didn't have as stringent of laws that we have, then they would those imports would be taxed at a higher rate. And supposedly this would also prevent leakage, which means U.S. industry relocating overseas because they could be non-competitive in the U.S., but they would be more competitive X. So anyway, this is carbon tax. This is getting a huge push from for their 4 major political action committees that have been pushing this concept. And the groups supporting this have lined up various organizations, the American Petroleum Institute, oil companies, OEDC, World Bank, American, the list goes on and on and on. So there's a huge push on this. And where are they focusing? Obviously, okay, can you see all that?
Yes.
Okay. Where they're focusing is on Senate Republicans. The Democrats tend to bloat as a block, and their pushback has been consistently from the Republicans. So the pressure's mounting. There's a new Republican caucus led by John Curtis of Utah that's pushing for some sort of policies. And all this is based upon the anthropogenic warming hypothesis, which again is, in my view, questionable. Now, there is something called the social cost of carbon. The concept with the tax is that there are costs associated with burning fossil fuels that are societal costs that are not compensated for or paid for by people that either consume fossil fuels or to make fossil fuels. That's the concept, that you got to have this tax to offset what's called the social cost of carbon. One of the first things Biden did is he came in and said, okay, we're going to recalculate the social cost of carbon. Well, how much damage or benefit even does carbon do? Well, what you do is you take your economic models, you plug them into climate models, then you plug them into assumed effects for the climate and the like. So it gets very crazy about how is it a cost? Does carbon really cost society? Or quite honestly, there's a growing level of evidence that says carbon actually helps plants grow. It helps plants become drought resistant. And none of the models, the so-called models that have been used, the DICE model, the PAGE model, has given zero credit to the greening of the planet and the increased crop yields. There is one model called the fund model that does give credit. So the social cost of carbon for these models that give no credit for greening goes from a cost of $50 to the fund model where you may have a benefit of 50 or 100 or whatever. And where is reality? Maybe it's in the middle, but who knows? But it's a very difficult calculation, but it is the basis for the carbon tax proposals. So with that, I know I've probably gone over. I always go over on any of my things, so I'll stop and in any questions or areas you want to explore a little bit far. I'll try to keep it short, but it's very difficult for me. You have to understand that, okay, Kesha?
Thank you for that. That was very important, very insightful. And there'll be a lot more I want to ask you and that we're going to be covering. And I hope that you would take the time to come back and let's follow up more. I think this is a good start for people to understand what's going on in terms of policy. And I just want to thank you for your fight, what you have been doing, along with members of the Right Climate Stuff. And also, as people may know, you and I met because of our association and friendship with now a uh, now someone who's passed away as of last month, a good friend of ours, Tom Weissmuller, who participated with me a lot on this discussion. And so I'm happy to have you on and for you to share with us and give us insight, sort of the nuts and bolts of what's going on. I think, as you know, LaRouche PAC has been at the center of this fight in terms of putting forth the idea more so of, you know, getting to what's the intention behind this, what's driving it, which I think is very important as well. You know, when you look at, you know, the climate policy as a real anti-human agenda, and what you've just laid out just goes to show they don't care about, you know, addressing the climate needs. It's more so the question of how do you push policies of population reduction, because that's what this is all going to lead to. And we can probably expect more of that coming out of these upcoming conferences, COP26 and so forth. But I think you've given us quite a bit of insight as to what people need to be fighting for, what they need to be looking in their uh, legislature in terms of opposing some of these bills that you outlined for us, and then also looking at what's going on in Texas and the increasing of energy to the grid and what that requires. So I very much appreciate you. If there's anything final you want to say, go ahead there.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. Yeah, we were sorry to lose Tom from the Right Climate Stuff. A fantastic scientist and a really good person. And I will say that early in my review of climate science, I came across some of the things that your organization put out, and I was extremely impressed with the objectivity, the science, the solid science behind it, and that's when I met you what, a couple of years ago now at the Right Climate Stuff meeting.
Yes.
That sort of clicked in, and I kept bragging to you about this thing, and you said, "Well, I'm from that organization." So I appreciate your efforts to try to get out reality and the truth and how this affects us. You know, there, like you mentioned, there are many hidden agendas. I mean, we scratched the surface on how many hidden agendas. It's just mind-boggling that this vehicle, this climate science vehicle, and climate catastrophe and the propaganda from global warming to climate change to climate weirdness, and now they're even calling it climate emergency, and it's even gone one past that. It's climate collapse, if you've heard the latest catchphrase for how they're trying to describe climate, and it's all under the heading of give us power, more power immediately, let us control society, and it's so anti-democratic, anti-freedom, and we can't be used. It's very complex. Climate science is very complex. But we can't let people use that as a cudgel to beat us in the head and say, okay, we're giving up our freedoms, our money, our control of energy, and you know, that's what's going on, and it's part of a bigger theme. And I'll just stop there.
Yes, very, very good. Thank you very much for joining today, and look forward to talking with you more. Thank you for sharing with us.
Okay, bye bye, Keisha.
Bye
Looking
bye.
forward to seeing you.